There you go.
The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings to the viewers of the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. How's everybody doing? This is a pre-recorded interview done Wednesday, November 9th, 2022, with an honored guest, Dr. Julius Garvey, the son of the great Honorable Marcus Garvey. How you doing, Dr. Julius Garvey?
Fine, fine. Thank you for having me on your show, with the Shaka. It's indeed a privilege and a pleasure.
This is a big honor for us because my first hero and master was your father. I was born in 39. He died in 1940. So I apprenticed under him indirectly in the Congress of Racial Equality, leading the largest of the Northern freedom movements and the only successful one between 63 and now. And a lot of my success was due to lessons I learned from the example of your father and your mother. Because I'll show you later, we had correspondence with your mother later. In fact, next to Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, and I should note that when I would travel to New York for Central Committee meetings of the Congress of Racial Equality, I would go by Michelle's bookstore, which is a bookstore of Malcolm X. It was a University of the Black community there. And I was searching for Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. And this was in 1965. And Michelle finally found it. But it was going to cost me $100.
Wow.
And that was a lot of money for a broke full-time core organizer. So I ended up purchasing these two.
Wow.
And I've had this in my library. The only person that could touch it is me. And then the volume 1 that you've added to.
Yeah.
This is not the original. I gave it to a member of our martial arts team. He never gave it back. But before that, I gave it to Julian Richardson of Marcus Bookstore, where you'll be speaking this Saturday.
Yeah.
And they republished this, Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, volume 1. And so these are the most treasured books that I have I got 11,000 books here. These are the two most important right here. You hear me?
Wonderful. That's the heart and soul of Marcus Garvey.
Yeah.
And it was my mother who put it together from his speeches and his writings while he was in prison in Atlanta on the false charges on the false imprisonment.
Yeah, exactly.
But she's a hero of that piece of work as well.
Yeah, you had quite a mother. And I read her book, Garvey and Garveyism. I've read everything on Garvey that's out. You know what I mean? And the only things that I've read that I don't take notes on because I internalize it. The most important stuff, I don't take notes on it. I just read it and digest it. So your father and your mother and the movement that he led played a real profound role in my life and the lives of many people then and now and before us, before that time.
Yeah, I think, I think you're touching on something that a lot of people don't realize. My father was also a master psychologist, not a great charismatic speaker, but he understood people and he understood the mind, and he was always speaking to the mind. Because he knew that you have to liberate your mind from mental slavery, and that's the only way you're going to transform yourself.
Right on.
The miseducation that we had received, as you know, Carter G. Woodson has talked about that. We had been so miseducated, basically for 500 years. Well, at that time, let's say 250, 300 years, that, we needed a re-education. But we had to free our mind from mental slavery before we could even be re-educated. And he was a master of that. He always spoke to the mind.
Right on. In fact, in the Black Freedom Movement, some knew about Garvey from the beginning, like a Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, because he came from Trinidad. He was raised in New York. So, of course, he would see street corner orators, and he heard of Garvey. Yeah. But most of us in the movement had not heard of Garvey, and I was one of those. My father had, but he hadn't talked about him. And so it's only when Cronin's book on Garvey came out, which I thought was a good book. It turned out it wasn't, but for that time it was good because it told me about somebody who did the best organizing that was done up to that time or since. And that was at the time that I had undergone an awakening. So the freedom of the mind you're talking about, I entered the movement on remote control, ex-Marine, Marine Reserves, wanting to help my people, but not knowing myself or my enemy. And so it's when I underwent an awakening that I now call the 6-fold stages to mental freedom. Then I started studying my history. And at the same time, a few months later, the book on Garvey came out. And so he became the first master that guided me in my awakening. So what you're saying right there hits the nail right on the head. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And that's what he said. He said he came not to bring a revolution in terms of guns or bullets, but a revolution of the mind.
Right on.
We can only participate if there is individual transformation. It's okay to have an ideology, or it's even okay to have an action plan. But if you do not have that transformation of mind and that transformation of self, then you're going to mess up somewhere along the line. And you're not going to maintain your commitment to exactly what it was if you're trying to achieve, which is a reconstruction of African civilization. So he laid the foundation.
Yeah, well put. And if you looked at a Malcolm X, whose parents were Garveyites, he had to undergo an awakening before he was any use to our people, because unlike the rest of his brothers and sisters, he had fallen into the pit of mental slavery through hustling and drug dealing. He exaggerated his crime life, but he still wasn't awake. Yeah. And so he had to undergo that awakening, the same one I underwent. The person in the back here with the sunglasses, Amilcar Cabral, went. Right? And some of the movements of the 60s fell short because if their leaders had not gone through this, and their members were going to be misled. I'm not going to name the groups, but there were some where the leaders started off halfway conscious, and then because they didn't continue to work on that consciousness, then they took the movement in directions that it didn't need to go. And some of them were never conscious to begin with,
Yeah. I think Frantz Fanon, hit the nail on the head with that one. He said you cannot have a revolution, when you have what is it, black skin, white mass.
Right.
That you're still that Oreo cookie, what W.B. Du Bois called the double consciousness.
Right.
You have one consciousness, and that has to be African consciousness. My father said, I have an original African mind, and that's exactly what he meant. That his mind was basically focused on his sense of himself as being an African person.
Mm.
That double consciousness of somehow a black man in America, that is being defined by somebody else, and therefore you're not sure of who you are because you're trying to define yourself. No, you must define yourself right up front, and then you don't answer to anybody else's definition. If you're walking down the street and somebody calls out Joe, but Joe is not your name, then you don't answer.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody says John, and John is your name, you answer. But you have to have your identity, set in your mind as to who you are.
Mm.
And that's important in terms of especially leadership. And as you mentioned, that was absent in some of the leaders in the 60s.
Yeah, and that double consciousness, seeing yourself through the eyes of others.
Mm-hmm.
And then their definition of you becomes yours, and you're on automatic pilot and don't even know it, and therefore they can manipulate you and move you in any way possible. So one of the freedoms of the mind is you got to free your mind from assimilation if that's where you're at, because most Blacks in the US are not assimilated psychologically, but some are. And so particularly those who are highly miseducated. So that is really crucial when it comes to any kind of transformation. So I think that that point is very important, and we'll revisit that again, because that is the essence of what any kind of liberation is. The last time I saw you, the first time, was at Dr. Leonard and Rosalind Jeffries' home in 1998, and we had dinner, and it was my first time to meet you. I don't know that you probably don't know, but what came out of that meeting, in addition to you and I meeting, Leonard said, Dr. Theophilo Benga's looking for a job.
Oh, wow.
And so it's because we met and ate that I found that out, that I was able to hire him, and he taught at San Francisco State for 11 years.
Wow.
And,
That's great. That's great.
Great work. So that was a byproduct.
Yeah. Len is an old warrior. He's been on the road for a long time. So
yeah, he sure has.
For sure.
Yeah, him and his wife, beautiful people.
Yeah.
So for our viewers, you need to really understand this is a rare experience that you're going to be hearing from the son of Marcus Garvey, Dr. Julius Garvey. I understand you're a surgeon.
Yeah, cardiothoracic and vascular surgeon. I'm retired now. The last 3 years, just before the pandemic, I called it quits. It's been a long time, over 50 years practicing. So I avoided the mess that it would have been in the pandemic. So I was fortunate in that. So
what's the nature of that kind of surgery? What specifically?
Basically, it's the heart, the blood vessels, and also what's in the thorax, meaning the lungs and the esophagus, and in between what we call the mediastinum.
Oh, right on, right on. Yeah, so I know that your mother and father have been proud of you and all of your siblings. Before getting into this discussion, I wanted to show you a picture of a complex that was built in 1966, 1967, called the Martin Luther King Marcus Garvey housing complex. I built that after getting the city of San Francisco to give me 4 square blocks of land. The San Francisco Freedom Movement defeated the entire economic power structure of San Francisco for jobs. It was a 6-year movement. We organized 45,000 Black people block by block. We gave birth to the free speech movement at UC Berkeley because the white students had joined us and we put them through jail. They got radicalized and then they started the free speech movement. And it also gave birth to the experimental college at San Francisco State that was the forerunner of Black studies. We lost no battles, and not a single one of our members sold out. None of them took a dime for any of the movements that we led. And we had a brilliant team of people. So in 1966, I went to the redevelopment agency and told them that I had a lot of money, because at that point we could snap our fingers and get anything we wanted in the city, but we never thought of getting anything for ourselves. So I told them I wanted these 4 square blocks to build housing for my people. They said, "How much money you got?" I said, "I got a lot, $1." 4 square blocks, it was worth $300 or $400 million. And then I went to Washington, D.C. and lobbied the Senate. It was a part of a movement in 66, the same time that then Stokely Carmichael, Floyd McKissick, who I helped put in office as chair of National Corps, executive director, Martin Luther King, and the Deacons for Self-Defense were marching to pick up the movement there in Mississippi. And that became the Black Power movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so we lobbied the Senate, got that passed, came back, and then a guy named Jim Montgomery, who's still alive, a Black engineer, I had him go to work to draft the plans and stuff. And so we built this in 66, 67. It's 211 units dedicated to Marcus Garvey and Martin Luther King.
Well, that's fabulous. All I can say, that's amazing. And congratulations for all that work that you do. And
16,
you know how to organize and how to put pressure on the power structure. That's great.
Yeah, but it was your father's spirit in there.
Yep.
1,600 square foot apartment building for $170.
His life.
Yeah, because that's what your father did, was economic development, among other things. You know what I mean? And I learned that from Garvey. So I wanted you to see that.
Yes.
This is a dedication to your father, your mother, to the legacy of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and to the whole philosophy of Pan-Africanism that your father pushed, or, Ethiopianism,
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up in terms of economic development, because that's so important. We can be ideological, pure and ideologically free, but unless you have the economic development, you can't go very far, because then you always have to be begging or asking somebody else for something. So it's very important to empower ourselves economically, and we have to do it cooperatively. And that was your strength, your ability to pull people together in a unified group to be able to put the pressure where the pressure needed to be exerted. Congratulations.
Yeah, and we knew how to do the mass movement and how to do pressure, the power structure. But I did not, and many of us did not know how to build institutions, how to build businesses. And so I studied the Garvey movement for many reasons. It was the psychology of it. It was a history, and I was doing my own historical study as other people were, but particularly institution building, and especially economic institution building. So I learned that from looking at how your father and your mother and how the UNIA did their thing. That was the big model for me.
Yeah. As you know, they had so many businesses in Harlem, during the 20s, in terms of, restaurants, millinery stores. They had the newspaper, the publishing house, and, so many other things going on at the same time. They employed more than 1,000 people in Harlem in the different businesses that they ran. And that wasn't just in terms of the Liberty Hall in New York, but wherever there was a Liberty Hall, wherever there was part of the movement, they would own their own buildings and develop their own community in terms of what their needs were. And that's the only way to build community. You have to be able to have the skills, and the different things that you need, whether it's plumbing or the electrician and so on and so forth. And that's why he admired Booker T. Washington. Booker T. had that idea that, you had to be self-sufficient in terms of getting involved in the industrialization process. You have to have those skills. And you have to build from the ground up, as opposed from the top down. We didn't need that many PhDs. We needed people who could build community and be entrepreneurial within the community in a cooperative sense. And I think that's what my dad brought to the front, not only the economic development, but to do it as a group, as a cooperative effort, as a community effort. So the wealth stayed in the community. It wasn't one guy getting wealthy and being on the cover of Forbes magazine or Time magazine and saying, and I'm the richest black man here, or some other nonsense. That doesn't lift us up as a people.
Right. Yeah. In fact, when we built this, we used HUD because banks were not going to give me a loan. I was a full-time organizer and broke, and my assistant, who's an engineer, Jim Montgomery, didn't have any money. And if he did, they weren't financing black people. So we let HUD build it. Then we put our people in there and others, and they turned it into a cooperative.
That's right.
So as a result, the people could own it cooperatively. Now, one of the things that I really learned from your father, and I happen to be a Leo too, so it's kind of natural from my nature.
What date is your birthday?
August the 4th.
Okay.
Yeah, same as.
I'm the 16th.
Okay. Oh, no kidding. My. And your father was a pure Leo. You know what I mean? By the way, and I'm into astrology. He was in the stage of the solar-lunar relationship that produces revolutionaries.
Wow.
Lenin was in that stage. Malcolm X was in that stage. And people who pipe into the people, they are able to see ahead. So they're prophetic. And your father had the prophetic gift. I don't. Your father did.
Okay.
He saw many things. World War II, he saw it. He saw the rise of Japan going against Europe, and then at least part of Europe. And then he predicted that Africa would rise out of the ashes of World War II. He was prophetic. Your father was.
Yeah.
He had that gift. You know what I mean? That gift. But another thing I learned from your father was economic self-reliance. Finance your own stuff. And that was the key thing. You know what I mean? Of all the things, the most important thing, which means your people have to finance their own movements, as they did the Garvey movement.
As you see now, so many of the African countries are involved in debt so much that it's debt slavery as opposed to the other physical slavery.
Right.
They get deeper and deeper in debt because their debt is dollar denominated. It's not in their own currency.
Yeah.
So they have to sell something to the dollar currency to make the money to pay off the debt. So the debt just keeps piling up because their currency gets devalued.
Yeah.
It's an amazing, shall we say, escalator that doesn't take you up. You just keep, walking and walking and walking, but you're not getting any further. As a matter of fact, you're going backwards. And that's where they're at now. You see, because of this lack of understanding that you have to be self-sufficient. And you look at Africa, as you know, it's the richest continent in the world.
Yeah.
So again, it's a mental problem, not being able to understand that, what you just explained.
Well put. And in the case of Jamaica, when Michael Manley was trying to do good things for the people, at the same time, he went to the IMF, which is the International Dependence Agency, and got a good loan the first time. And then the second time, they stuck it to him.
Yeah.
And then from then on, you all had a self-reliant economy, just as your father had worked with his uncle and did bookkeeping and stuff, and he worked the land. You all were self-sufficient in food. You all had industries, milk industries and other industries, and you had raw materials. And then suddenly you're into this debt, your currency is devalued, and you're put under control of the West.
Yeah, the IMF writes your budget for you.
Yeah.
And the World Bank, and all of the manufacturing was destroyed within Jamaica.
Yeah.
And we had a bauxite industry. Michael Manley, wanted to increase the prices, and they said no because the prices were controlled internationally. So they just moved the bauxite out of Jamaica and just somewhere in West Africa and so on. But that's what happens when you play the international game. But it's a game that's stacked against you. by the IMF, by the World Bank, by the World Trade Organization,
Right.
and even by the United Nations.
Right.
African people are not in the Security Council. So, Africans are 1.5 billion people, and yet still we're not a permanent representative of the Security Council. So our voice doesn't count. So we're still being marginalized.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the American New World Order at the end of World War II when they had the Bretton Woods Agreement. And at that point, so they've supplanted Britain. So now they're going to make the world dependent on them, including Britain. I think most people don't get it, that the first group they colonized was Europe, because what they went in and created NATO, that was to put their military in Europe to occupy it. The Russians were no threat to them. What they wanted to do is make sure that Europe could not bust loose. And then after that, then the IMF, which was originally created to save Europe, then they had the so-called Marshall Plan, which was really NATO. It wasn't really the Marshall Plan. Then that becomes like the agency that was going to save Europe that will now be used for Africa, Asia, Latin America to make them dependent. So the very thing that you're talking about, because the everyday people in Jamaica had the skills, like you said, bauxite, their milk industry. You made milk. So what happens? They lower the thing so you don't put tariffs. You can't put tariffs to protect your own goods. And then they bring in powdered milk from the United States and destroy your milk industry.
Yeah.
So it's going back to what you're saying, that if you've got a self-reliant mind, and in the case of the Caribbean, some unity between a variety of islands, and in the case of Africa, some unity, which a person like Nyerere tried to do, or a person like Nkrumah wanted to do, then you have something to fight them with. But you don't need all their goods. I think it was W.B. Du Bois who said, don't give up your independence for some refrigerators and Mercedes Benz. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, you're hitting the nail right on the head.
You see, unfortunately, they have many different ways of putting pressure on governments and on leaders.
Right.
Either through, like we're talking about the IMF or the World Bank, or, for example, in the case of Michael Manley and Kwame Nkrumah and so many others, they engineer coups against them.
Exactly.
You see, a coup was engineered in a sense against Michael Manley.
Right.
In terms of weapons being brought into Jamaica, which we never had before.
Right.
We don't make ammunition, we don't make weapons, but they were brought in, obviously, by the CIA to take down Michael Manley, which was supposedly a socialist government. And of course, the same thing, happened in places like Ghana, Burkina Faso. We know about Lumumba and Cabral, and in Mozambique, and so on. So it's an ongoing, war, shall we say, of trying to shake ourselves loose from the shackles of slavery. It's just slavery in another way.
Yeah.
Through debt slavery now, and an economic system that is still tied to London and Washington.
Yeah.
And we see that playing out now in terms of NATO and its confrontation with Russia. And of course, this is being engineered by the United States. Again, to perpetuate, shall we say, American hegemony, which, as you mentioned, replaced the British Empire, after World War II from 1945 onward. And now we have the American Empire, which rules the world. And America doesn't want to give up that role because it suits America. But people don't want it anymore. We want a multipolar world. We different groups of people can live under their own, cultural and economic as well as traditional auspices. Yeah. China is on the rise, definitely, and is considered a competitor. India is on the rise and doesn't want to necessarily follow either Europe or America. And we see changes now in Latin America, which are wonderful. We'll see what Lula does in Brazil, but changes in Colombia. We see, America's had to go to Venezuela to ask for oil. So, the Venezuelans are no longer pariahs. So there are changes happening, which hopefully they'll gel and create a multipolar world. And that's where Africa has to come up and come into her own as a geopolitical entity.
Well put. And America's in decline.
Yeah.
And by 2040, 2050, China's going to displace America as the dominant economic power. And China's been smart not to compete with America militarily the way Russia got caught in the arms race. They haven't played that, but they are incrementally building their military, but they're building up their economy. They're taking 800 million people out of poverty. So America is facing decline. You have potholes that could almost sink a car, bridges that are collapsing because of the national security state, the military industrial complex. Everything's going into the military budget. And so, and then at the same time, there is the shift in population. America is going to be a majority people of color country, and by 2044, 2045. And so a lot of this Trumpism and everything else is a response to that. And so they can hold it off, but they can't stop it. It's like a flood.
Yeah.
So, you're right. As these forces begin to weaken, it's going to open up, and they are weakening, opportunities for people around the world to breathe their own breath and be free. And that includes here as well. So, yeah, that's a very important point you're making. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think you can read the tea leaves and pretty much see that, all over in terms of the response in Africa to the pressure of America wanting Africans to take sides in terms of the Ukraine-Russia war. And most Africans saying, no, we're not going to take sides. We want to stay out of it, because we've been involved in 2 world wars. Which were not our wars. We were brought into them because we really had no choice, because we were under colonialism. But we don't want any more of European wars. You want to fight among yourselves, that's fine. That's your problem. Except don't blow up the world with nuclear weapons. Think for the rest of us to live, and breathe freely, and enjoy life. So I'm proud that the Africans have taken that stance. It shows a maturity that wasn't there before in terms of understanding, the global, political network and the forces that are at work. And I think India has followed the same pattern and saying, no, we're not going to do everything that you say. We're also standing back. So that's the foundation for a multipolar world.
Yeah,
I'm very happy to see that happen. I hope that President Biden isn't rash enough to want to destroy everything if he can't be the boss of everything. That would be tragic, of course. But as you know, we've been there before with Kennedy and Khrushchev, and cooler heads prevailed, and Khrushchev backed off, and so on. So, hopefully this conflict in Ukraine will end up with cooler heads prevailing, and they'll come to some mutual understanding without, pressing the red button, which will not help anybody.
Yeah.
Fortunately, in the process, I think the Ukrainian people are being destroyed. They are the proxy war for America.
Yeah, America could have prevented this from happening. And all they had to do was allow Ukraine to be neutral. And instead, what they wanted to do was to create a situation to weaken Russia by surrounding. I'm not a supporter of Russia. I certainly don't support their invasion. But the fact is, when you surround a country with a military union, which in this case is NATO, and then want a country that had been an integral part of Russia to align with a country that's surrounding them, you are creating a condition for conflict. And so this administration so far has not supported negotiation, and they should be involved in negotiation. And the country is being destroyed.
Yeah.
So you could weaken Russia. Russia's already weak. It's a second-rate power. Its main strength is nuclear weapons. It's got huge resources, large landmass of any nation on the planet, and they should be a third-tier or fourth-tier nation. But bad leadership has propelled them to that. In part, 27 million people they lost in World War II and didn't get any help to rebuild it later. But bad leadership has been a part of their problem. But yeah, you're right. Africa, Asia, Latin America, stay out of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Black people here, stay out of it. And the key thing is America, because they've invested so heavily in their military, they've gone down because of that. Not just not building the country up, but all the wars they've lost. You know? So
Martin Luther King was talking about that in terms of the Vietnam War. America losing its treasure overseas, in terms of fighting in Vietnam, instead of investing it, internally.
exactly.
Create prosperity for all of the people instead of just the elite group at the top.
Exactly.
So it's deja vu all over again. This time, how much money are we putting in? Billions after billions into Ukraine to fight this war that Ukraine can't win it for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And a little mouse going up against a small elephant.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they're getting some stuff back. All they're going to be involved in is a protracted conflict that is not going to help the people. Not at all. You know what I mean?
It's also weakening Europe, because Europe depends for its energy, oil and gas, at least 40% of their energy from Russia.
Right.
Of course, the wheat supply and everything from Ukraine. So it's weakening NATO. It's an overreach. And because of the overreach, they're becoming weaker. And if you look at Europe, I mean, okay, Germany is still the most industrialized country. France doesn't have anything apart from our colonies in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, England already is a basket case with their Brexit, and you see what's going on politically in terms of the leadership crisis. So they're in deep trouble, and they're confused. And so there are no bright spots right now in Europe. The German leadership, after Merkel is, so-so, not really charting a course that's good for Germany or for Europe. But everybody is bowing down to America per se. But I think that Europe is pretty restless about it because now they see the cards plainly on the table that they're also being sacrificed to American hegemony.
Yeah. And who wants to go through a cold winter for somebody else? And America could say that, but America is not affected by that. So they can run around telling everybody else, boycott Russian oil and gas and stuff. Yeah. But at the same time, are you willing to tell your people that if they were in that position, you would have really lost the midterm elections? You lost your term, period. Yeah. So, you're telling other people to do what you're not prepared to do for yourself. So, that's correct.
It's important, to learn from history because, we have made progress every time Europe has set out to destroy itself. Like after World War I.
Well put.
When the Garvey movement arose from 1914 through the 20s, as you know, the 1914-18 war, the Great War, so to speak. So we made that progress because so many of our people fought overseas and came back. Also, so many Americans moved from the South to the North and got involved in the industrialization process and had greater expectations. Mm-hmm. A lot of things started then in terms of our mental transformation. The same thing after World War II. As you know, the Manchester Conference there in 1945. That was when, a lot of Pan-Africanists got together, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and others, along with W.B. Du Bois and Padmore and so on. And then, from there, the Pan-Africanism moved to the continent. And by 1957, Ghana was independent, falling into the 60s. So after World War II, we again made progress. I consider this World War III, as far as we're concerned as Africans. If we stay out of it, then we will make progress because I think Europe and America will be weaker.
That's a very good point. I'm going to come back to that. Just in terms of you and your family and your siblings, could you tell us something about yourself, your mother, Amy Jock Garvey, and your siblings, how they were raised, influence of your mother and father on you?
Well, basically, I'll start with my mother because Both myself and my brother. My brother was 3 years older than me. My father died when I was 7. He was 10. The last time we saw him, we were in England, and I was 5 years old. My brother was 8. So, especially me, my memories are only those of a small child.
Mhm.
They're fun memories, but they're not intellectual memories in terms of conversation. And my older brother may have had a little bit better, understanding in terms of conversations per se. But basically, as far as understanding my father, we were really raised by our mother because we came back from England in 1938. And, the war was coming up. My brother had arthritis in his leg, and we were advised to go back to a warm climate. So my mother brought us back to Jamaica. And my father died in 1940. So, both of us were youngsters. And she's the one that raised us. She never remarried. And as you know, she was a true Garveyite. She was his right hand, so to speak, in terms of the organization. She had a background as a legal secretary. She went to the best high school in Jamaica, the Wilmer's Girls' School. So she was well educated. And as we talked earlier, she put together the philosophy and opinions, but she did the women's page in terms of the Negro World newspaper, and she was very active in the organizational structure itself. Then, of course, when we moved back, obviously, when they moved back to Jamaica, then we were born in Jamaica. And, subsequently, she raised us in Jamaica, myself and my brother. And she taught us about her father. Everything I knew about him came from her, not from his mouth.
Mhm.
Until, I became older and was able to learn for myself in terms of reading, etc., etc. But the basis of my understanding of my father and his work was based on my mother's, personal teachings at home. So I credit her with that and with raising us. Fortunately, she had some resources of her own in terms of family. So we were raised, in reasonable circumstances and went to good schools, private schools, etc. So we had the best education that Jamaica could offer. And she insisted on that. And, she always focused on that in terms of education and discipline, if you will, and not letting down the Garvey name. She made sure that was implanted in our minds. So we had to sort of live up to Marcus Garvey, if you will, as our ideal. So he was very much idealized as a father. He could do no wrong. And of course, he wasn't there. So I didn't know anything bad about him. I only knew good things about my dad. So he was the best father possible in terms of an ideal sense.
Mhm. Yeah, your mother played a real important role in the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, the name of your father's organization. She brought order, in my reading, she brought order to the operation, the administrative operation of the UNIA. When she came into the office, put it in order.
Yeah.
And then when he was in prison, as you point out, really administratively ran the organization and put together his writings, Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, Volume 1 and 2. And her book, Garvey and Garveyism, is an insightful political book. Brilliant, brilliant. It shows a strong.
A lot of the inner workings of the organization,
Mhm.
an inside view. So it's very, very useful from that perspective.
Yeah,
For students, for people who want to understand, the trials, the tribulations, and why things were done in particular ways, etc.
strategies and tactics for organizing,
Yeah.
a lot of things. It was a thoughtful
Mhm.
presentation. Could you describe some of the conditions facing Blacks in the Caribbean, South America, the U.S., and Africa during the time in which your father began his organizing? And from your understanding, what's some of the things that inspired him to do what he did in organizing?
Well, basically, if you look at the Caribbean at that time, and of course it'll be similar in the U.S. But as you know, after the end of slavery, which was 1838 in the Caribbean, anywhere 1834, 1838, and you might say the beginning of colonialism, 1885 up to 1886, the Berlin Conference. My dad was born in 1887, so he grew up basically in a colonial situation. But at the end of slavery, the people who had been enslaved got no reparations for their 250 years of free labor. It was the plantocracy. It was the slave owners who got reparations from the British government. And I think that the British people were taxed, and I think they paid off the taxes on those reparations maybe 10 years ago or something like that. So what you had was, a large number of people, hundreds of thousands at that time, certainly in Jamaica and throughout the Caribbean, it would be millions, who had no land and had no resources. And so what they had to do then was go back to work on the plantation, some of them. Others, seized land. And this was a situation now of continuing agitation. And of course, one of the major rebellions in Jamaica was in 1865, the Morant Bay Rebellion, which was a rebellion over land because the farmers had no land to farm. And they were, hungry, they couldn't feed their families and so on. Now they were protesting against the British government. Well, the governor, pulled out the troops and they killed, like 800 of them and hung the leaders, Paul Bogle, etc. So those were the conditions. And you find that, for example, from Jamaica during, my father's growing up and from the post-slavery period, there was intense migration because they had no land in Jamaica. So they would go to work on plantations in Cuba, in Costa Rica, on the Panama Canal. So this was true of Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and so on. That people were landless and they were looking for work to feed their families and to grow their communities. And it was similar, in the States in terms of no 40 acres and a mule, as you know. And then, having to do the sharecropping, which, as you know, was just another form of slavery in terms of white domination and oppression. So you could never pay off your debt to the owner that you were sharecropping for. So, this was continued enslavement. So this was the situation, certainly throughout the Caribbean, throughout the south of the United States, coming up to the 20s. And the same thing clearly was true in Africa because colonialism itself, now the inner penetration of Africa started in 1884, 1885 at the Berlin Conference when the European powers sat down and divided up the continent, among themselves. By the way, America also was a signature to the Berlin Conference, although they did not get territory, but they agreed to that whole dispensation of African territory and African people. So the interior was penetrated and the countries were colonized and their economies tied to the metropolises of these other countries. As you know, King Leopold from about 1890 to 19, and about 20 years, 30 years, he killed more than 10 million African people in the Congo, and others he cut off their hands and so on, and he brutalized so many. Leopold of Belgium. So those were the conditions more or less worldwide for African people. The Germans, they committed genocide against the Herero in Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia. So this was going on, up and down Africa in different places. I can remember, watching movies about the Zulus and the English coming up from the south, and they had this machine gun, rat-a-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, and the Zulus, all they had was the shield, and despair, and they were just going down by the thousands. I mean, it was horrible to witness. And I know that an average of, when the Africans came up against the Europeans, the average kill ratio was like 500 to 1. I mean, it was slaughter because the Africans, all they had, was a spear and a shield. If they had a single rifle, they never had the repeating Sten guns and so on. So those were the conditions.
And out of that, your father develops some ideas about what African people needed to do to overcome these conditions. What were some of the ideas that he had?
Well, it's important to know that these weren't just thoughts or whatever it was. My father made a journey. First he was in Jamaica. He was a printer, a master printer. He learned the trade from his godfather. But then he traveled, just like I mentioned, other Jamaicans. He had a maternal uncle in Costa Rica. He traveled to Costa Rica. He worked on the plantation there in Costa Rica. He also went to Panama. And then he traveled throughout South America to Colombia and Peru and other places. And that was from about 1910 to 1912. When he came back, he went to England. And he traveled, throughout England, to Ireland, to Scotland, to Wales. And he traveled on the continent to Germany and Spain, etc., France. So he was well versed in terms of the actual conditions, not from reading a book. And this is what is important, and this is what makes him different from a lot of people who will read a book and, and even if you look, for example, at how, Trotsky and so on, and Lenin created communism. This was done in the libraries of England and Europe. They sat down and read this and read that and said, okay, this is capitalism and this is how we're going to counter capitalism. Marcus Garvey was not just a book learner per se, but, he took courses at Birkbeck College. He read voraciously. He worked with the African Times and Orient Review and Egyptian, so that he had tremendous knowledge, but he had experiential knowledge, first-hand knowledge of people and their conditions and how systems worked. And this is what he saw. And when he came back to Jamaica now, 1914, as he said himself, he was laying on board ship, and he had heard all these stories coming out of Basuta land and so on, and he'd seen everything. He said, everywhere I go, I see that the black man is at the bottom, and no one represents him. He has no ambassadors, no men of big affairs, no presidents, and so on and so forth. And it came to him that he had to change that situation for black people. And it was like a revelation. That was his moment of awakening to his calling on board ship coming back from Southampton to Kingston, Jamaica. So by the time he got to Jamaica, within 5 days, the idea of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, African Communities League, came to him, and the organization was registered. Also, in the meantime, he had read a lot about conditions in America, and he had read about Booker T, and then he corresponded with Booker T, and he was impressed by what Booker T. Washington was doing at Tuskegee. And he talked to him about coming up, because what he wanted to do was replicate the conditions of Booker T's university there in Jamaica. So he's coming up to see, the conditions and how the Tuskegee Institute was run, and to raise funds. Booker T died in 2015, but he came up anyway in 2016. And Major Moulton was the president then of Tuskegee. And he went around the country in 38 states in 1 year on his own dime, again looking at conditions. So, he knew all about the Ku Klux Klan, etc., not from books, but from traveling through all of those southern states and seeing how, Black Americans lived at that time. And then, he ended up transferring the headquarters of the organization to Harlem, New York, because people wanted them to stay. And because every time they set up a chapter, somebody tried to disorganize it and turn it into something else, because there were the communists and there were the trade unionists and there were the integrationists and different people, trying to, shall we say, gain a following in terms of the socio-political climate of the time. So that's what he was up against. And then, as you mentioned now, in terms of the ideas, he saw that, the only way that circumstances of African people could be changed, it would have to be, it was a worldwide situation. He knew that it was an American situation. And this was one of the things that made him different from some of the American leadership at the time. Much of the American leadership at the time was about America. And they knew about the North and they knew about the South, and they knew about the whites and they knew about blacks, but they did not understand that the whole system was a global system of white supremacy. They thought it was an American system, the southern white or the northern white, etc. No, this was a system that has been engineered, for hundreds of years in terms of the second rise of Europe from 1492 onward. So he understood all of that. So he understood then that the only way to combat it was through unity of African people worldwide. You had to come together. You could not do it independently in Jamaica or independently in the United States or independently in Africa. It would have to be a worldwide. That's why he named the organization Universal Negro Improvement Association. And then the second part of it was African Communities League. We had to build our communities. And what's in a community, we had to build our economic, we had to have our own educational system, we had our own culture. So all of those things had to be nominated and denominated by us in terms of our own understanding of who we were historically. And he knew all about the pharaohs, he knew all about Nile Valley civilization because he had read about it at African Times and Orient Review, as I mentioned. He was a reporter, a journalist for them at the time when he was in England, Deuce Muhammad Ali, etc., etc. So he had all of this background, and he conceptualized that history was a cyclic endeavor, because we had the rise and the fall of empires. The rise of another was the Greeks, the Romans, the French, the English, etc. So he felt that it was Africa's time for a resurgence, a renaissance, and he called it the redemption of Africa. So that was his goal, to redeem Africans and to redeem African civilization with our own traditions and our own way of life, which was different from Europeans. So those were some of his ideas, just in a general sense.
Yeah, and to go back to his tour in the United States after Booker T. Washington died, and I think your point that you made earlier about the Tuskegee Institute, though it received a lot of philanthropy from whites, because blacks didn't have a lot of money, they put up some, but not enough to build a university. Everything built there was built by blacks, and every building was built by blacks, so that there was that economic self-reliance within that. And then his travels, as he travels around the United States, because he's an outsider, he's able to see and appreciate some things that sometimes when you're just in a country, you take for granted. And his comment was that blacks in the United States at that time were the most advanced group of blacks in the world. And we were under sharecropping and everything else, but we had also built up a system of institutions and businesses at the local level. And so he had an appreciation of that. Now, there's an account in Tony Hill's works on the Universal Negro Improvement Association, where he gives an account where Garvey, while trying to build a movement, he's had these movements fall apart for the reasons you give, people coming in and hustling it and stuff. And he hadn't, according to the writings here, he hadn't really got the real mood of blacks until he attended a meeting of Herbert Harrison, the Liberty League. And it was right after World War II. And he sees a militant consciousness there. And then he begins, and he comes back, he's allowed to speak at the second meeting. And going back to your point about we've tended to benefit from wars that the Europeans have fought, he's seeing blacks who were disillusioned by fighting in World War I because their leaders like Du Bois and others had said, fight to make the world safe for democracy a piece of bull, and they were angry. And so he was seeing what he called a new Negro. Martin Luther King had the same term for Black people fighting in Montgomery. And then he saw, and this was Hubert Harrison, who acquainted him with this, the driving force of the African American, race consciousness. He sees that. And so these are just documents on his exposure. It's when he comes in contact with the anti-war sentiment of Blacks in the US and this militant race consciousness, because they're arming and fighting against the Klan and against whites when they're moving into their community, that Garvey finds his message. Because at that point, Garvey now has the pulse of the militant Blacks, which is going to launch his movement. And that is when he launches the movement over the peace conference in Versailles. And he puts forward demands and captures the imagination of the African world. And then that goes off. So it's like a fusion of the African in the United States and the African in the Caribbean. And then Garvey's consciousness, as you say, is global, with the grassroots in the South who also have that view. And it takes off.
Mm-hmm. I think, what you're saying is correct, that, he felt the pulse of the African people at the time. And, all you have to do is imagine the situation in the South coming after slavery, but you're still being abused and oppressed on the sharecropping system. Right. And all you want really is to get a piece of land, okay, to be able to work it and to feed your family and grow a family and have a community. That's all you want. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to be involved with a white man who has been your oppressor for a couple 250 years. You see, so integration was not on the Black man's mind. Right. What was on the Black man's mind was to get away from the white man, if you will, and develop his own community, his own land, and take care of his own family, because that was one of the big things after the end of slavery, looking for family, because people had been separated. So there was this drive on the part of the African American to create their own communities. And this was what Garvey picked up on when he traveled to those 38 states. And as you say, the whole mood of making the world safe for democracy, that those who had fought abroad brought back to the country, and those who were working up north. So this was a time of ferment. A million African Americans traveled north in that decade from 1910 to 1920 and on. So that's how you had, the ghettos of Harlem, if you will, and Philadelphia and Detroit and so on. So this was a time of change. It was a time of transition, and there was ferment in the minds of African people. Now, what do we make of this period, which is post-slavery and in some sense post-sharecropping? And here we are in cities in the north. We're working in industry, maybe menial jobs, but we're still working in industry. We've gotten away from the cotton, which was not doing well because the soil had been depleted, etc. And, so it was a whole new time. And he fit right into that with his understanding that he developed from personal experience going around the 38 states, traveling around the world, and knowing the whole scenario of what was happening at the time. There was a transition towards freedom and democracy. And he capitalized on that, if you will, with his organization and his ability to articulate it to the common man.
Yeah, and as you say, Blacks here were caught in the same bind that Blacks were caught in the Caribbean and other places, landless. And in this case, no 40 acres or a mule, and no right to vote. And because it's Hayes-Tilden Compromise, this is now the second post-Reconstruction. That was the first. So Blacks decide to go on the path of economic development. And that's a big path. And Garvey feeds into that. he comes out of that experience himself and sees it and appreciates it. So there's a union of these two groups, Caribbean, African, the African in America. And a lot of Africans in America come from the Caribbean through the slave experience or directly from Africa. So that blending was extremely important. Could you describe some of the programs and organizing that Garvey did under the UNIA?
Well, basically, it was pretty much a nation in exile, meaning they had everything from a civil service to the African Orthodox Church. They had the nurses, they had the African Legion, the Black Cross nurses, the African Legion, and they had all of the different economic development projects. They had the printing press. They did most of the printing in Harlem, for pamphlets, etc. They had the Negro World newspaper, a weekly, which developed the largest following, if you will, during that period of time. In terms of number of people that read the newspaper on a weekly basis, and it was translated, the editorial page, into Spanish and French, and that was his main, modus operandi for spreading the word around the world. Because, as you know, we had been divided by language as well as geography. So he had three languages: the English, the Spanish, and the French. So, there was a motor corps in terms of transportation, because they advanced the transformation of products and so on. We talked about the restaurants earlier. So, everything was there. And then they had all these cultural events at the Liberty Hall, especially on the weekends, where there was a juvenile division as well, for the young people, as well as we talked about the nurses, etc., for the ladies, and they took care of all of these events in terms of the cooking and the arrangement and what have you. So it was a complete, cultural situation that one can become a member of the UNIA, and you worked at something during the week with it, whether it was part of the UNIA or not. But then you would go to lectures in the evening, or on the weekend you'd have social events. So there was an African space where, I can remember, I think it was Malcolm who talked about his dad, when he would go with his dad to meetings and so on. He said all of a sudden his dad, when he went into the Liberty Hall, he changed. He stood up straight, like he had a backbone. And when he was seeing Ethiopia, the land of our fathers, the land where the gods used to be, I mean, it was like a transformation. And then so many of these people who may have been, sleeping car porters or maybe cleaning the streets or whatever, but they'd get to the Liberty all the weekend and they'd put on their African Legion uniform, and they were Africans, So this was a cultural, psychological, educational transformation of the average African American, which was in line with this whole business of, reconstructing us as a people after this period of enslavement and oppression.
That's a very important point that I hope people get, because what you're describing is Garvey was setting up a government in exile, and he had this idea of being a nation within a nation, but a government fighting for independence, for the independence of Africans around the world, especially Africa. And he could have that idea because he comes out of an island in which Africans are the overwhelming majority. And even though they're colonized, they can see somewhere down the line where they can run their own island or run Africa or run wherever we are in the world. So that concept, so he had a paramilitary group that marched, and the nurses and all the rest of that, even gave out passports,
Birth certificates, wedding certificates,
yeah, marry your own people, govern yourself. Mm-hmm. And Black people here, who were not the majority in the country, though parts of the South, they loved that because it gave them an idea of rulership, and there were some blacks in this country that had that idea, but that was an idea that someone who's coming out of a majority situation, you're 90% or 98% of an island, even though you're under colonialism, you can see that's your future down the road. And Garvey had that vision. So that is extremely important, that idea that we could run our own society and everything else. Now, Garvey is successful in building a mass base, a huge mass base, the largest of its time or since. What was the reaction of the United States government and of the Western powers to the Garvey movement?
Well, severe hostility, shall we say. If you look around the world initially, the Negro World newspaper was banned in many countries. In some countries, if you're caught with it, I think in at least one country the penalty was death. Certainly, you could be imprisoned, etc., etc. And anybody who was thought to be an agent of the UNIA was expelled from these colonial territories. This happened in Senegal and the Francophone countries particularly. But Garvey himself was banned from many of the other colonies in Jamaica, for example, Trinidad and so on. The governor wouldn't let him land, etc., etc. So there was severe hostility, and of course, that was also present in the United States with J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI. He was a young lawyer and just involved in the Bureau. It wasn't yet the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It had another name, but it became the FBI. And he was looking to make his name. And the first black agents for the FBI were hired to infiltrate the Garvey movement. So this was done way back in 1919, or before even 1919. And there's an internal memo in 1919 by J. Edgar Hoover that is a Negro agitator up in Harlem. His name is Marcus Garvey. And he hasn't done anything yet, but we have to find something and some way to get him. You see, he considered that was his job. Negro agitator, meaning that somebody who was agitating for the freedom and liberation of black people. So the FBI was after him from at least 1919, and with internal surveillance and external harassment. When he left the country, they wouldn't give him a visa to come back in, and so on. And so eventually, within the United States, they cooked up the scheme of using the mails to defraud. Oh, by the way, there was an attempt on his life. This was back in 1919 again. Somebody came into the office and said, I'm looking for Marcus Garvey. And my dad, sitting at his desk, said, yes. The guy pulled out a gun and shot 4 times. I think 2 grazed him, 1 in the head and 1 in his leg. They caught him. And the police came, took him away. But somehow he committed suicide in the first 24 hours under police custody. Somebody sent him. Okay. And he was going to spill the beans, and they didn't want that to happen. But in any event, they trumped up this charge about using the mails to defraud relative to the Black Star Line, because the Black Star Line was a major project of the UNIA ACL that attracted a great deal of attention. It brought a lot of investment of Black people at the time, and the whole concept behind it, because goods and services moved intercontinentally by ship at that time. There was no airlines to do this, so that was the way to communicate between continents. So the idea was, we had no control over shipping at that time, and even though you would pay, whatever the rates were, you'd always get second-rate accommodations if you're traveling overseas and what have you. So the concept behind the Black Star Line was to have a fleet of ships that would link Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States in terms of trade and commerce, and in terms of movement of people back and forth. So that's what they it was registered in Delaware, I think, in 1919. And within 1 year, $1 million were subscribed to pay for these ships and so on, which, was a significant amount of money at that particular time by selling shares, again, of cooperative venture per se, and only being, shall we say, only African people were allowed to invest because that was our wealth. So anyway, they cooked up this scheme that somehow they were using the mails, the U.S. Mail to defraud African Americans. Can you imagine that? The FBI was concerned about a black man using the mails to defraud other black people. Well, that in itself is a bit of a joke that they were concerned about African people to that extent. But the trial went ahead. There was absolutely no evidence. The only evidence they had was an empty envelope. The witness that they had perjured himself because he claimed that he worked for the UNIA when he didn't, and he admitted in the trial that he was coached by the prosecuting attorney. So he had a perjured witness. He had a prosecuting attorney who committed perjury himself by coaching this guy into perjury. And the judge should have recused himself because he belonged to an organization that was hostile to the UNIA and to Marcus Garvey himself. So despite everything and appeals and whatnot, he was convicted and he ended up spending 3 years, pretty much 3 years in jail before Calvin Coolidge commuted the sentence. But it didn't end there when he went back to Jamaica, because when he commuted the sentence in 1927, the condition was that he had to be deported immediately. So he had no chance to, conduct the proper business with the organization, the books, etc. They had seized the books of the UNIA as well as the Black Star Line books. So they actually ruined the Black Star Line itself, even though they claimed to have been concerned about the black investors. But when he went back to Jamaica, he was a hero there, etc., etc. He started the first political party. But again, Jamaica was colonized, so the British government there had him under their thumb. And the party that he organized, one of the planks of the platform was that the British judges, if they were abusive and incompetent in terms of the judiciary, that they should be fined and sent back to England and so on. Well, this was considered to be contempt against the Queen. So he was convicted of contempt of court and he was put in jail for 3 months. In the meantime, he had won an election to the city council and so on. So he started the first political party. He started the first major congregation of labor unions. But the British government was harassing him. They were tampering with his mail. Money wasn't coming in, money wasn't going out, mail wasn't delivered, and so on and so forth. That's when he decided to go to England. So that they wouldn't hamper his movements there, which they could do in Jamaica, which was a colony. So that was some of the persecution that he had to go through.
Yeah, and J. Edgar Hoover was in charge of the Internal Bureau of Investigation that later became the FBI. Mm-hmm. And he worked in league, as I know you know, this is for the benefit of the audience. He worked in league with the prosecutor of New York, the DA, to frame Garvey. And so using the mails to defraud was used as a charge because it's a crime of moral turpitude, meaning that if you're convicted of it, you can't get American citizenship. And Garvey...
By the way, let me just interrupt you for 1 sec. They tried to catch him on that charge of moral turpitude, because he was under surveillance the whole time. And my mother was his private secretary. Okay, so when he traveled out of state, like she would go with him. So they would be peeping in keyholes and so on and so forth to see if they were sleeping together. But they couldn't find anything, so they had to drop that. But that was one of their ways in which they were trying to trap him. As you know, they tried to use that against Martin Luther King later on, the same FBI people and so on. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just when you brought up moral,
that's an additional thing I didn't know. Only someone in the family would know that. That's not in any writings. Yeah. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover has some problems of his own in that line. So, of course, he'd be looking for anything on somebody else. But using the mails to defraud was considered a crime of moral turpitude. So then that means you can't get citizenship if you're convicted. And as you point out, there was no evidence that there was any fraud involved in the way in which UNIA stocks were sold and money was gathered. And in fact, the offense he's charged with, he was out of the country when those occurred, trying to purchase a ship that a Jewish person was supposed to purchase and ended up pocketing a good part of the money. And so he's charged with something he had absolutely nothing to do with. And the people prosecuted alongside of him, they were let go. But they went after Garvey because they wanted Garvey out. And he had been out of the country for a while in the Caribbean, South America, organizing support for the Garvey movement. And Hoover did everything he could to keep him out of the country. The whole idea was to separate Garvey from the headquarters of his base because his movement was global, but the U.S. was his base. And that's why Garvey was seeking citizenship. So this was a whole move on the part of J. Edgar Hoover to split the organization and destroy it by separating the head from the body. And that's what he ended up doing. And J. Edgar Hoover, of course, would then become our major opponent in the 60s that we would have to deal with as well. So Garvey went up against the combined forces of the Western world and did pretty good in spite of that. And one of the things is the amazing thing that he did with the pushing of his ideas through the Negro world and the way that spread like wildfire all over the earth. I remember one of our leading scholars sending me an article. And this article was written by a Jewish scholar, and this was his conclusion. He said, Garveyism was stronger than Zionism. This is a Jewish scholar. He said, because for Zionism, if people don't know what that is, the establishment of Israel and the dispossession of the Jews on some biblical grounds or Judaic grounds that this was their land in the beginning, and treating them like they weren't there and removing them is being done right now, that project Israel could only take place through Western patronage and support. The Balfour Declaration from the British, they claimed that they had a right to Israel, and then Truman recognizing Israel, and then plummeting billions of dollars into Israel every year to prop it up. But he said, so Zionism rested upon Western support. Without it, it couldn't have existed. This is a Jewish writer. It was Asa Hilliard that sent me this article. And but he said, Garveyism was rested on an idea. And this idea propelled African people worldwide. And I would say at the bottom of this idea was the love of Africa and African people that didn't depend on any money. Even though Garvey had a base and they were financing stuff, it was based on love. Whereas now Pan-Europeanism is based on the fact that 2 world wars nearly led to the genetic annihilation of Europeans. One more and they will cease to exist. And so they had to unite to prevent each other from cutting each other's throats and killing each other. You know what I mean? Mainly to check Germany. But Germany was being checked because they just wanted to do what Britain had done and everybody else had done, mess the world up. So what your father built on, that idea of the love of Africa and the love of African people, is a strong, powerful force that came from the islands of the Caribbean, that came from the shacks of Black people in the United States. And so those of us who are brainwashed and put out all these things about we hate ourselves, yeah, some of us do. But the majority of us don't. Most of us are not Clarence Thomases. Most of us love our mamas and our papas. And that's proven by, how we treat our people. And at a time in this country where we had nothing, the only thing we had was each other in the Caribbean. That's all you had. And that is the key to your success. And so that's the amazing thing about the UNIA, was the power of an idea, the love of the people, and then the magnificent skill of the people that put that idea out there, just like the revolution that occurred in Haiti. The magnificent thing they did to knock down the French, the British, the Spanish, and today paying for it. And that's something we have to do to get the Americans and the West hands off of Haiti and let the Haitians take care of the Haitians, because the Haitians love each other. Not all of them. They got their elite that is in bed with the white boy. But so what your father did was magnificence beyond magnificence, power beyond conception, a mouse going up against an elephant and proving itself to be stronger than the elephant, because this idea that Garveyism planted is still alive today. It's still strong today. So could you talk about the impact of Garveyism on Africa as it went on, the African independence?
I think one of the things that's so important, many of the writers, particular people like Cronin, but some of our own writers, they act as if to say because the Black Star Line quotes failed, or because Garvey spent time in jail and he was deported from the U.S., that somehow, Garvey came and he had this rise and then he had this fall. There was no fall. Garveyism is alive and well. It has spread throughout the world. And that's why you and I can be having this conversation. You had your revelation. How many people have you met whose first name is Marcus? How many people have I met who told me that, my dad, my uncle, my grandmother was part of the Garvey movement, or I grew up and Marcus Garvey's picture was in the house, and that's how I learned about Africa, and da-da-da, and da-da-da, and da-da-da. I mean, it is disseminated, throughout African people worldwide. That's not failure. That is success on a great scale.
You better believe it.
Get specifically, more to what you're talking about. As you know, Kwame Nkrumah said that, when he was studying, I think it was at Lincoln, it said, he read, Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, which my mother had put together. And he said it was, it was like a light bulb going off in his brain. He never read anything like that. I mean, it turned him around completely. And as you know, he became the father of Pan-Africanism in Africa. And as you also know, Pan-Africanism basically was a diaspora event. Basically not just starting with George Padmore, but from so many, Americans and others before that who had gone to Africa and what have you. But, the African Methodist Episcopal Church and so on and so forth, these were Afrocentric organizations, basically Pan-African organizations. So Pan-Africanism started in the diaspora. And it was after the 1944, conference there in Manchester, where there was the Kwame Nkrumahs, the George Padmore, the Jomo Kenyattas, the fellow from Malawi, and so on, who were students at the time at the conference. They took it back to Africa, and all of those leaders have stated, how much they were influenced by Marcus Garvey's thinking. Including what's his name from South Africa, Nelson Mandela. Because the ANC at its birth, it came out of the Garvey movement. Many of the members of the ANC were members of the Garvey movement there in South Africa. So you'll find that all across Africa, that many of these nationalist movements came out of a Garvey experience, shall we say. So that's how the Pan-Africanism traveled there. And it was the same thing in the Caribbean after 1935. Then you had the 1938 riots. All of the Caribbean leaders really came out of the Garvey movement, whether they were in Dominica or Barbados or Trinidad and so on. They were influenced by Marcus Garvey. So there was this whole spreading of his idea of us as a people reclaiming our civilization and our freedom that has stayed, with us over time, and is the nexus of so many things, including the civil rights movement, including the Black Power movement, including the Panthers and so on, and Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, they may not know it, but they stand on those shoulders of so long ago. I mean, I don't think President Obama understands the shoulders that he stood on. because I don't think that he has done enough for African Americans in terms of his 2 terms of president. So and this is where we're failing to some extent to really internalize at the highest level in terms of how we relate to the power structure here in the United States. We don't have to imitate anybody. We're African people with the oldest history and the oldest traditions and the most wisdom in terms of our traditions, because we're the original civilization. And we understood who we were as a people in terms of our origins, and we understand our relationships to the universe. And no other people have seen it that clearly. Everybody else has come about it secondarily as we moved around the world and as we carried that to them, and they absorbed it then into their cultures and within their different environments. But we have the clearest imprint. If you look at Kemetic civilization or the Nile Valley civilization, this is true civilization. This is true understanding, the awakening of the individual. And we can't go into it now in terms of Osset and Heru, but this is what it's all about. The complete understanding of self as a conscious person, as a conscious presence, that is one with the universal consciousness. And then you function as that, which is what makes you fully human, not just responding to the 5 senses and so on with your intelligence and satisfying the 5 senses, shall we say, through desire and seeking pleasure, or staying away from hardships, or simply being non-involved. So that's the response at a very, very superficial level, which is basically the animal level of response with some degree of intelligence. But Africans as a civilized people, we are much deeper than that, because we're a spiritual people with mind as an intermediary to body. So we're spirit, mind, and body. We're not just mind and body. And that's the difference, shall we say, between what we have produced in Africa and what Europe has produced. Europe has produced scientific materialism and a philosophy that's all about the intellect, but it does not deal with humanity in terms of its totality. And that's why there's so many problems. People don't even know who they are, sexually at the present time. It's optional. I mean, this is ridiculous. It's not optional. I mean, it's basic in terms of your DNA and natural processes. But that is confusion, and that is chaos, and that's where we are. And that's why we need a new paradigm. The world has to go in a different direction. I think that European civilization as such, in terms of its hegemony, is at an end, because it can't solve any of the problems that it has produced. It's simply recycling them it's changing for change's sake without understanding cause. It's not linked to cause and effect. It's simply changing the appearances on the superficial level, and that's getting nobody anywhere. And I think the young people understand this. This is why they're so hooked into drugs and so on, and even suicides. They don't see a future because everything seems so confusing and confused. So it's our time as African people.
Yeah, profound points you're making here. Some historians, and these are white historians, that jokingly say that the idea of European civilization is an interesting idea because it's based on savagery, barbarism, and cruelty. And so the very idea, after they go off and kill off the Tasmanian people, the Aborigines, 90% of the Native Americans, all the Carib and Arawak people in the Caribbean, and a host of others, then they take on this pontifical attitude that the British and the Americans, in a rougher way, try to take on, thereby becoming the judge of civilization when their whole thing is barbaric. Mm-hmm. Your point about the despiritualized mind, that's key, because in removing the spirit from the mind, then they're operating on the lower mind. And what is that lower mind? It's greed, it's conquest, it's power. the nobility of trying to serve something higher than yourself, to try and be kind, to try and treat Mother Nature as an extension of yourself, or you're an extension of it, and treat it delicately. Those mentalities of waging war and everything that begins with the Aryan, the lords and masters, and then I'm not talking about Hitler. I'm talking about the ones that come out of the Caucasus Mountains, that come out of Russia and Ukraine, 3,000 to 4,000 BC, and impose a harsh system on the world. It takes time, but that's the system that we're seeing now. And then it morphs into mercantilism, it morphs into capitalism, all the isms. But all the isms at the bottom are cruel. And so this mentality that you're talking about that goes back to high civilization, and I started with the Twa, the world's first people. They are the first to civilize the whole planet. They're everywhere. And there's no power over them. All the males and females are equally empowered to govern every phase of society. You find that among Native Americans. You find it in the South Pacific. You find it among the Asians. But particularly, you find it among the Africans, after hunter-gatherers, the communal orders, and then in Kemet and in other orders. And so it's high-level civilization. We're in barbarism right now. So this bringing the world back to a mind where the higher mind, the spirit, guides this lower mind, and where some love and kindness are key, and where women are treated with respect. Because I think one of the marks of civilization for Africa, when you knew you were in the presence of Africa, it was always like the Etruscans, you knew those were Africans. Why? They treated their women good. You know what I mean? Wherever you see the African, or the ones who were the first in Greece, they treated their women good, And then if you look at India, the Dravidians, the Dalits, women were the measure of the standard of civilization. As Malcolm said, you measure the level of civilization by the treatment of women. Or even in Islam, Black African Islam was distinguished from Arab Islam by not only the respect for women, but in Mali, for example, the women were treasured more than the men. And the proof of the pie is in the pudding. So they had polygamy. The women had their lovers, and the husbands went along with it. Why? Because it was a system of balance inclining towards the women. And the men respected it. Whether they liked it or not, they went along with it. You know what I mean? I'm not saying we go back to that, but I'm saying that if you're going to measure how well a society is doing, then it's by how they treat their women, how they treat their elders, and how they treat their children. Those who are considered to be weak but are strong. Because in weakness, water is the strongest force, and it's considered weak. It overcomes everything. That's like a good woman. She'll overcome everything. She raised you. She knows you better than you do. You know what I mean? Respect her. You're in good shape. You know what I mean? So I agree with you. And there's an awakening going on right now among the youth, the 20-year-olds and younger, and some older, who are drawing on this. And they actually want from their elders anything that will help them out, because they're in a trap. And I know this is global, not just in this country. Your observation about Garvey and the Fifth Pan-African Congress, which was in 1945 in Manchester, Garvey's spirit was there because Garvey, unlike the other Pan-Africanists, had always called for the immediate independence and unification of Africa. Immediate. And so when you have George Padmore, really Malcolm Nurse, and Kwame Nkrumah organize that, Du Bois honorary chair, it's that spirit. And that spirit kicks off the African independence movement. And Nkrumah goes back and leads the independence of Ghana. And then, I know you know this is for the benefit of the viewers, and some of my viewers have heard this and others haven't. A little Asian man attended one of the meetings of Garvey off a steamship line. And he was working for the French. And he heard Garvey say, Africa for the Africans, Asia for the Asians, Europe for the Europeans. And he said, I asked myself, because Kwame Ture, then still Stokely Carmichael, was in North Vietnam to support the liberation movement there during the war in Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh told the story. And I had read the People's World Communist Party newspaper. They had given the same account. He said, after I heard Garvey, I asked myself, what am I doing working for the French? I need to go back and organize my people for liberation. So then he said to Stokely, later Kwame Ture, he was a friend of mine, so I don't want to desecrate his name, but I'm giving the correct name in each era. He said, what is your black behind doing in Vietnam? He told him the story of how Garvey inspired him to go back to Vietnam. He said, you need to get your black behind in Africa and help Africa in Africa's independence. And so Garveyism didn't just move Africans. Garveyism moved Asians or anyone that was going for freedom. And so that is a powerful, powerful thing, you know?
Yeah, I had received something, and unfortunately, I can't find it anymore. But it was a letter from a Japanese university, and they were looking into Pan-Asianism, and what they were implying was that the Japanese had a Pan-Asian concept that was mirrored on Marcus Garvey's Pan-African concept.
Mm.
And as you know, the Japanese wanted this Pan-Asian empire, and with Japan as the model, so to speak, over the empire. So their ideology came out of the Garvey movement in that sense. Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that, and it makes sense. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And since the original Japanese was Anu, A-I-N-U, black. I had a Japanese exchange student who gave me an actual carving. I have it here. A tall woman, and she's African, and then two small men. Now, the Anu are small, and it's in Chinese script. So I asked one of my Chinese American colleagues at Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State, what did it mean? She said, female general. She was large in size, not because she was physically large, it was because these are Anu, or small people, they're Chua, pygmies, so-called. But she was a military leader, and, they had to be fighting against the Asians who had come into their land from Korea that called themselves Japanese, but they're the original Japanese, black people, you know what I mean? So they need to go back to that idea that their original people had, which wasn't trying to colonize anybody, but trying to be free. But that Garveyism would affect that, wow. That's all I could say is wow. What's your view of the impact of Garveyism? You mentioned this briefly, but if you want to go into this anymore, and I should note that every year, Martin Luther King spent a month in Jamaica, a month every year. And I think there were reasons why he went to Jamaica, and he did it for the purpose because he had a heavy schedule like your father did. He was going everywhere all the time, and he used this to think, reflect, and write. His books were basically written in that 1 month period. But what do you see in terms of looking at the movements of the 60s? And I want to end this by going into the current stuff that your book is addressing now. But what do you see as some of the impact of Garveyism on the various movements of the 60s?
Well, we already mentioned, Malcolm, in that both his parents were Garveyites, both the mother and the father. So he grew up in a Garvey environment, and he ended up going through different phases, so to speak, in his own development, and came out of it as a Muslim, shall we say, but modified that in terms of his travels to Africa. So that he was coming up at the end of his life, unfortunately, but he was coming up with that African American
Organization of Afro-American Unity.
The Organization of African American Unity, which again you can see that's really modeled, after Garvey per se, and that was the strength that he really understood this, and again it was typical of someone who had traveled outside of America, And I think he got a great education when he went to Mecca, when he went to Ghana and other African countries. He went to Egypt and so on. So certainly, that is exemplary in terms of Malcolm. I think Martin Luther King, the same thing. But perhaps a little more distant. Obviously, it wasn't a family thing. But I think when he went back to Montgomery, I think part of what he did was the Montgomery Improvement Association. I don't know whether that's modeled after the University of Negro Improvement Association, or it's just accident in terms of words. But that it says something to me a little bit in terms that his ideas were similar. And as you just mentioned, he went to Jamaica several times, and of course he made a speech at maybe 1965, I think, at University of the West Indies, where he talked about the influence of Garvey on him and on America, in terms of outlining the problems within Black America, shall we say, within the United States, and its solutions, and moving African Americans, towards a better destiny than was, shall we say, marked out for them by the structure of the system itself. So he definitely understood the trajectory of Garveyism. Of course, he adopted, shall we say, Gandhian principles in terms of peaceful resistance and so on. And of course, that was necessary, because you cannot go to war with the American war machine. Certainly not within America itself. As you know, they're still killing us on the streets. So to think of a revolution here that's a military a revolution is impossible. That would never happen. So him adopting those principles, I think, are important for the survival of his people, our people. I think Nelson Mandela made a similar wise decision in terms of, of what when he came out of jail in, what was it, 1990, I guess it was. Maybe he gave up too much because the conditions there haven't really changed, and the white South Africans still own 90% or more of the economy. So that I think he gave up too much in terms of compromise. But as you know, Martin Luther King was not looking at compromise in terms of his statements, particularly his latest statements. He was saying that the system itself had to change, because the system was a warlike system that was spending its resources abroad, and those resources need to be used here to transform the society itself. And America needs to look up, and face its own problems. And he was going to Washington to get that check that was owed to Black people, and he didn't want to get any check that was not signed. Insufficient funds. And I think that was the one that got him killed when he made that speech. Mm-hmm. The Black Power movement, as you know, Stokely Carmichael was definitely in some of his A-Track Brown and so on. They were definitely, in the same mold. I think, Stokely was definitely a Garveyite in that sense, as well as a Pan-Africanist in the wider sense. And I think all of the protest movement, so to speak, have this national tinge. The Black Power, the Panthers, and coming up to the present time, it's still existent. Now, of course, a lot is being framed within the request for reparations. And I think progress is being made there. Certainly there's something within the Congress and so on, HR 40. And it's at least being debated at the present time. And I know that something will come out of the Congress. But it's important that we understand what reparations is all about. It's not just repairing us, but it's repairing the society that has oppressed us at the same time, because they cannot be reparations without transformation, and this may not be recognized, but that has to be the outcome. And unfortunately, in some sense, this is what got Martin Luther killed, assassinated, when he said this plain, that America, had to change. America had to be transformed. It had to face its original sin. The reparations movement has to hold America up to the same mirror, to have America look at itself in terms of what it has done, and how do you then repair the damage? You have to transform yourself, just as we have to transform ourselves in terms of our enslaved mentality. They have to transform themselves in terms of the idea of being a master, or the idea of white supremacy. It's total nonsense. It's a mental concept that has no basis in anthropology, archaeology, DNA, nothing. It has no basis in anything except the concept in some ignorant person's mind. So that has to be thrown out. And then let's be able to learn how to live together. And I think the way to learn how to live together is going to be what I call African humanism, which is what I think we birthed with civilizations,
Right.
6,000 years ago. So that's going to be the paradigm that we're going to move towards.
Yeah, in the case of King, King was at Ghana's independence ceremony. He was at Nigeria, Ezekwe's independence ceremony. His files on Africa show an extensive set of contacts between him and African leaders, actually more extensive than Malcolm's, and a lot of these have not been read. I have a brother named Menu Ampin, who's an authority on King, particularly his revolutionary movement, and he notes this. There are huge files of those correspondence. So King saw the link between the Black freedom movement here and the African independence movements there. And King supported armed struggles in the world, the Vietnamese struggle, African independence struggles that used arms, because he saw it was practical and possible. The only reason why he used peaceful struggle here is because to take on, as you say, the war machine is suicidal. So that was King in part. So, he had that appreciation. And then him and Malcolm, they only met once, but they shared an attorney and they shared ideas. And so King and Malcolm, King had agreed with Malcolm's position on challenging the oppression the U.S. was bringing to the Congo. And so agreed on that. He agreed with Malcolm's human rights position, and in fact was clear on it. Malcolm was talking about, like a lawyer, going to the United Nations, the international bodies, and charging America with human rights violations. King, on the other hand, because he was coming from the ground up, battles in the Black liberation movement, he said in 1965, the movement had changed from a civil rights to a human rights movement for this reason. The Constitution granted civil rights. But if you're going to move for real transformation, you're going to have to go beyond the Constitution to human rights. And so he defined that as economic rights, economic empowerment, rights that Europe has taken through the Roosevelt New Deal, medical things that Roosevelt didn't have, but that they have, Social Security. But he was talking about those things that have to do with concrete empowerment of people. And he said, as you say, America had to be restructured. And he didn't like capitalism. Malcolm never studied Marx. He did. Malcolm didn't need to. He knew it was, as he said, crooked as a pretzel. And King had reached the same conclusion. And he never liked capitalism. Of course, he was a Christian, so he didn't like the fact that they weren't spiritual and stuff. And he had a point there, though, not necessarily having to be Christian. So King had those kinds of things inside of him. And then he comes out of the South, out of a Black community that has some deep Black pride. It's a middle-class Black community, but it's Black. Most of his advisors were Black. You know what I mean? He had a few white ones, and they were ones that gave him good advice. And those are when the Kennedy administration said, cut yourself off from. And then, as you pointed out with Kwame Ture was a Pan-Africanist, a socialist, he was influenced by Garvey. It's very clear in his thrust. And then his relationship with Nkrumah, it's very clear. And Nkrumah, Black Star Line. And as you say, Nkrumah said, of all the books he read, the one that inspired him most was The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. It had to, you know what I mean? And he was one of the most imaginative of Africa's leaders, bringing in Africans from all over the world, working in his administration and so forth. And George Padmore was his best advisor. John Henry Clark told me about Padmore's influence. Padmore is the one that advised him once a week to open up his presidential headquarters to the people, so the people could come and voice their opinions. Padmore gave him the idea for the Organization of African Unity. That came from Padmore, you know? So that was the collaboration of an African from Trinidad with an African on the continent, you know what I mean? So that was that. Now, in the case of myself and others coming out of the Black Freedom, Black Power movement, I was at one point a strict Garveyite. I believed that our people would actually return home because we never chose to be here in the first place. But then I went to Africa in 73 and worked in the Ujamaa villages and chaired the political committee of the Sixth Pan-African Congress in 74. And I realized that ain't going to happen. Most of our people not leaving, coming back to Africa. Some will, and they have a right to. But what we need to do is Africanize this reality, you know? And that's become like my mission, drawing from, and a lot of us, drawing from the best of Africa and Afro-America and the Africans in the Caribbean, Africans throughout the world, to restructure this society from unjust to just, from crooked to straight. And so that's a different kind of mission. So I see the African-centered movement. I'm a revolutionary. Dr. Obenga said, he stayed at my house for 4 months after we hired him. And I got a chance to see his study habits. I would be at this computer. He was at the desk in back of me writing the book on the pharaohs that he's written 1,000 pages on. And so I took him out to state finally after 4 months to get housing. And he's getting out of the car. And he's very observant, Obenga. And Obenga is a scholar too, you know, and no ego. If he gives you a criticism, it ain't personal. You should listen to it. You know, so he says, Shaka. I said, what? He said, you are revolutionary. He says, among the African-centered scholars, now this is the one I already knew, and I'm not particularly proud of, you the only one. The only one. Who in the hell wants to be the only one? I know there's others outside of the African-centered scholars who are, but the African scholars are revolutionary. And they don't know it because what they're putting forward is revolutionary. Those ideas about a just society are revolutionary. Leonard Jeffries and Rosalind Jeffers, they're revolutionary. Asa Hilliard, who you could never, I was talking to Julian Richardson, whose story you'll be speaking at Saturday, and his brilliant daughter, Blanche, will be there, Blanche Richardson. And Julian said, I never heard anybody say a negative word about Asa Hilliard. He was a kind, brilliant Black man. I wouldn't have been tenured without his help. FBI is trying to deny me a job. He was in charge of my tenure committee. So here he is, the only dean who's Black at San Francisco State, up there arguing for this radical, crazy Black man. You know what I mean? I owe my tenureship largely to him. A beautiful brother, absolutely beautiful. So your point about, you know, the need to draw from African civilization and to deal with these higher mind principles and combine it with reorganizing the society economically, politically, socially, in every possible way, that's in us. And we just need to be conscious of that. And that's why I wanted you on this show, because I know some stuff about you. I know you're radical. I said, I know your father's real proud of you. Your mother's real proud of you. You've taken Garveyism to another level, you know? And that's why I wanted to end this on is the point of your writing, adding to the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, and to bring it up to date to apply to the world today. And one of the things I like here is a statement that you make here. It says, this revised edition of Volume 1 of the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey is an attempt to fill the need for the Black Lives Matter and human rights movements currently attempting to transform the socio-political and economic landscape. I really like that because it's telling me you're current and you're seeing the implications of movements that are going on right now. And I might say to some of the viewers that are watching this show, don't see, because some of the Afrocentric people, they don't even mention Black Lives Matter. They act like, well, because they got some contradictions that ain't so Afrocentric. Well, we all do. But without that Black Lives Matter, without the mismanagement of COVID-19, Trump would still be in the White House. A big fat victory. You knocked a fascist-oriented president on his fat behind. You did that. You know what I mean? And so that's something that is coming from the youth of the hip hop generation. Those in their 50s, those in their 40s, those in the 30s, those in the 20s. So what do you see as some of the implications of the movements for social change now and the relevance of Garveyism to it?
Well, the point is that the system itself hasn't changed for the 100 years since Marcus Garvey. So Marcus Garvey's ideas are just as relevant, and in terms of the necessity of transforming the system and the necessity of building our own systems based on our own traditions and our own culture, our own philosophy and our own spirituality, as we've been sort of alluding to as we've talked. So that's still a preeminent necessity. And, we represent, 1.5 billion people. We are the original people in the world. We have moved all around the world. We have populated the world. We have civilized the world. We have to understand that and not believe that our history started, with our enslavement or that somehow there's some group of people that's superior to us. There can be no group that's superior to us because we are the original people. Now, the young people have to know that. And, when I'm saying young people, the Black Lives Movement, the hip hop guys, and so on, because they may be resisting the oppression of the moment, but they have to understand that they stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before, and that they themselves are representatives of the highest culture that has ever existed on the planet. You see, and they're trapped within a system, and they're resisting the system, but the system is not superior to them, and they don't have to then compromise by adopting to the system or changing themselves so they can get along with the system. No, they have to stand on their own 2 feet and their own traditions and help to transform the system while they're building their own system. Because you can have a system within the system, in terms of you build your own communities. I mean, you have your Jewish communities that are built on their own ideology, et cetera, et cetera. You have your Chinese communities, et cetera, et cetera. You have Muslims communities, et cetera, et cetera. So, we have African American communities that are built, definitely on our own understanding of who we are as human beings and our relationship to the environment. And we have the prototype for that in terms of our civilization. So we must know our history. And that's one of the things why, I revised, philosophy and opinions to some degree to make it more relevant and, of course, to make it more concise, because I know young people don't like to read a lot. So it's not 400 pages, it's 100 or so pages that people can read through. And it contains, you might say, the kernel of Marcus Garvey's thinking. And I think that's important, because in the same way that it was able to radicalize, if you will, Kwame Nkrumah, it can radicalize the younger generation at the present time and give them something to hold on to in terms of, yes, that sounds right. Yes, that's what I would like to do, et cetera, et cetera. To know that, somebody has done that before, somebody has walked that road. It gives you a little more, courage, if you will, and conviction to walk that road yourself. And I think that's the purpose of trying to continue the legacy of Marcus Garvey, to show that someone has gone up against the system. And while they may have been bruised and battered, they never gave up. And the torch has been passed. It's like a relay race. The baton has been passed. And now it's your turn to go up against the system, to transform the system, but not to give up your own authenticity in terms of your identity and your ability to determine reality for yourself. You don't have to accept anybody else's definition of reality or of who you are. You can determine reality for yourself. And that's what your consciousness is all about. That's what makes you a human being in the first place. So, I think it's important for the young generation to know about Marcus Garvey, to know what his thoughts were, and to know the struggle is not just 100 years old, but it's even older than that, in terms of the invasion of Africa over time, by the Assyrians, by the Hyksos, by the Greeks, by the Romans, etc., and so on, up to the time of the second rise of Europe and our enslavement. This has been a process, but we are part of that tradition of resistance, and it is then our responsibility to know that history, to know those traditions, and then to redeem, as my dad would say, to redeem Africa, to redeem African consciousness, to redeem African humanism, and to rebuild African civilization.
Yeah, well put. And, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, which at its peak hit 50 cities or 50 states in the United States and 50 countries in the world, that certainly is a movement that has impacted the world. Mm-hmm. And your point about we have to build on what we have in our past, Garveyism, the great civilizations that we have built. And one of the things that was good about this movement, and it continues, is that they had studied, their leaders, many of them had studied previous movements, and they actually went out and improved upon them. And so one of the things that they had realized was that while in the 60s or in the 20s, movements of singular leaders worked. But now with the breakdown in the United States of Black communities, Black families, and everything else, singular leadership won't work. It's got to be collective. And so they pulled out of the chapter of Ella Baker, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but they didn't know, and some of them did, because some of them that I know did, that they were pulling out of the organization of hunter-gatherer and classless age-grade societies where all the males and females were equally empowered to run a society, not a single one. And so they ended up with group-centered leadership that threw off the intelligence agencies and everything else with computerized electronic systems where they're networking all over the place. And so who's leading this thing? They don't know, you know what I mean? And so that was updating stuff, improving even on Ella Baker's ideas. So that was one idea. And then many of them have been aware of the Garvey movement, and a number of them have studied African civilization. Some have not, but some of them have. And so they have been drawing on some of that. So that is one of the lessons that comes out of that movement that was able to not only impact Blacks, but brown, red, and yellow, and white. And that's a part of a transformation. So I think another thing is that we learned in the 60s, Malcolm learned it from us, that in the US, the African people in this country are in a strategic position because we are inside their house. And so when we move, as Malcolm said, you could mess up the furniture, and then you can create chain reactions. What Malcolm didn't come to appreciate was, and he would have had he lived longer, is the main reason isn't just because we're here inside their house, but because our culture, in this case, African American, but this is true in the Caribbean, South American culture, Africans in Europe, the same thing. Our culture in the United States, what I call New African, a mixture of both African and New African elements with stuff we have to get out that's the vestiges of slavery. It is the culture of popular choice in this country. And it is particularly the culture of popular choice of the youth. And it's the youth that produces change. And it's interesting. I interviewed the Minister of Culture, Emory Douglas, for the Black Panther Party, a really beautiful brother. And I didn't know this. He was pointing out to me that the American Indian movement was inspired by the Black Panther Party. Now, that's a hell of a compliment, since Native Americans have been fighting before we got here and have continued to fight afterwards, so that we would give them a little inspiration is fine. I know they got their own culture and they stand on their own 2 feet. But the fact that we could have that kind of influence on them, or the Brown Berets, the Chicanos or the Puerto Ricans, the Young Lords, they were inspired by the example of Black liberation movement, in this case, the Black Panther Party, or the San Francisco freedom movement, as I pointed out earlier, gave birth to the free speech movement. So we create chain reactions. When we understand our power, then we know how to use it. But we have to be conscious of what we put out there. Don't put mess out there, because if you do, you're going to inspire something that's wrong. And some of the stuff that an Eldridge Cleaver and people like that did, later on, the Young Lords would say that was absolutely crazy. You know what I mean? So if we're going to be crazy like a fox, not stupid. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So we have a culture. We need to appreciate it. Africans in the Caribbean have a culture. Quit talking about, I'm just a Jamaican, I'm not from Africa. Quit talking about here in the United States, I ain't no African. It used to be, I ain't Black. You know what I mean? To be Black is to be African. You know what I mean? Be proud of your roots. And a lot of the young people, and a lot of our people are, but some of us are still brainwashed. So your point, I think, is well taken. You started off with the point that your father came here with the idea of freeing the mind. And we're ending on the same point. That is, the next generation, and you're right, it's a relay race. If any of us think that one generation is going to produce liberation in the belly of the most powerful beast in the history of the world, but one that's going down, I like to say like Humpty Dumpty. And when it goes down, they won't be able to pull it back together again. But we have to be in a position so it doesn't fall on our heads. Yeah. And so we can progress as a people. And so what, as your father said, what you know about what you did great yesterday will inspire us to do greatness today and tomorrow. I am now a neo-Garveyite. I was a strict Garveyite. Now I apply certain principles. I'm at my point where I should have ideas of my own I've learned from my elders. But the key point is, take Africa, this inside of you and in your reality, and Africanize your reality. Mm-hmm. And why don't we have an Africa town? Some of these Black communities wouldn't be busted if you had something to unify yourself against redevelopment agencies like, and I'm not talking about the Chinese to copy them, but like Chinatown, because they didn't have the problem with identifying with Chinatown. But, we're going to run around and say, Africa, what? Hell, make it mysterious. Put those pyramids up there and everything else and make it clear it's Black so somebody wants to come and buy your stuff. You know what I mean? So your points are to the point. And I looked so much forward to this discussion because I knew the spirit of Garvey's in the house, but then Garvey has gone to another level. And that's with Dr. Julius Garvey. You hear me? And I know your mama's proud of you. I wish I had known your mother and your father. And your mother was one special spirit, one special spirit.
Very special. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful woman. And the proof of the pie is you. And I'm sure
just a little bit to try to carry on the legacy, because I think it's important, and the responsibility of each and every one of us.
Right.
It's not just one person out there, a charismatic leader, etc., etc. Right. No, we need all the followers, and each of us has to be a leader in our own right, because right. Every day we go out there and we represent ourselves, and in representing ourselves, we represent our people. So if it's our responsibility to manifest Africa every day in every particular way that we know about Africa, and which we can know by understanding our true self, because Africa is born in us. We don't have to be born in Africa. Africa is born in us, because
Right.
that's our reality, the African reality. And that was the original consciousness of what it means to be human. And we have to do that internal search to get to that awakening and then manifest that spirit in the world. So
Right.
it takes us back to Ma'at, as you know, which is that spirit of unity and order and harmony and righteousness and justice and peace and well-being, etc., etc. That's the heart of a civilization.
Right on. Right on. You're going to be appearing at Marcus Bookstore this Saturday. And for people who know, Marcus Bookstore is in Oakland between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. And Dr. Garvey will be signing his books. So you should go there. And I want to say to the people who've been viewing the show, there you go. Nice. Isn't that beautiful? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey, which were compiled by my mother, Amy Jakes Garvey, but revised by me for the 21st century.
I want to close this with a letter that your mother sent us. I'm not going to read the whole thing.
Okay.
But, and I'm going to give you a copy of this when you come over.
Aspect of what my mother did. She taught a lot of young people. A lot of people came to the house at 12 Mona Road in Jamaica to learn from her, including people like Tony Martin and Rupert Lewis and many others. Sonia Sanchez, as I recall, too. Yeah.
This is dated October 23rd, 1971, from 12 Mona Road, Kingston 6, Jamaica, West Indies. And then it's directed to Brother Tashaka and others of the Afro-American Institute. That was the name of an organization that is now called Pan-African People's Organization, Malcolm X Unity House. Our headquarters was Malcolm X Unity House. The main meeting room was called Marcus Garvey Hall. And that seated about 300 people. And by the way, one of the publications we put out, Black Man Speaks, which was the name of one of your father's publications. So when I say I'm a Garveyite and a neo-Garveyite, and we printed this on our own printing press, you know, and we put out our own newspaper as well. So this is a letter. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but dear brothers, greetings. Thank you very much for the Black Man Speaks and your precious letter telling me of the great work you all have undertaken in the interest of our oppressed race towards full freedom and independence for Africa's children at home and abroad. That was Garvey's slogan, Africa for the African, those at home and those abroad.
Yeah.
I am thrilled that the message of Garveyism has taken on such wide dimensions in America at this time, that the Black minority sees its salvation only with the members of the Black race all over the world, that unity and the spiritual power that is inherent in Black people will generate and activate our methods of obtaining freedom we seek. Now, here's your mother giving orders, as I'm sure you got some. Now, brothers and sisters, you must harness the youth into active service, the kind of service that will restore family life, that will take the delinquents off the streets and alleys. That will respect womanhood, and that women stop cheapening themselves and put a value on their bodies and demand the respect, love, and devotion of their men. Women are the incentives that white men have gone into the jungles to get riches in order to give their women the best in life. Now the white race is declining. Alert our people to the fact so they will stop imitating them. They are going down because of their exploitation and suppression of the darker peoples of the world. But we are rising, and we must be clean in body, mind, and spirit. And then she goes on to talk about how Marcus Garvey, said that the wars of the future will be waged along scientific lines. And she said that we must now prepare ourselves scientifically. You're an example of that. And she saw that her children were prepared that way, but she was speaking for our race. So I wanted to close this, and I'll give you a full copy of this. This is treasured for me. This publication we put out for our organization, Pan-African People's Organization. And this is in the front page of the publication. So,
okay, I look forward to that. Thanks.
So I really want to thank you, brother. This has been wonderful, magnificent. And it's food for thought for people to digest and use as they organize in their communities to produce power for our people. Is there anything else you want to say in conclusion?
No, I'll be visiting you guys on the West Coast, and I hope to see you there. And I hope that a lot of people read the book, because it's important in terms of knowledge of our history over the last 100 years, and gives ideas of how we should be functioning today, and in terms of still challenging the system and building our own systems and building our communities, and really uniting and caring for each other, lifting each other up. That's one of the negative side effects of our oppression. Very often we don't help each other. We look only for ourselves, selfishness, which we have absorbed from our oppressors. But that's not an African perspective. Our African perspective is cooperative and collaborative and collective. So we must return to that as a people, so that we rise together as we help each other on the path into the future in terms of our own liberation and creating our own systems of freedom and how we wish to manifest our freedoms.
Right on. So the message from Dr. Julius Garvey is, first, free your mind, and then do everything else to free your behind, which is building power in your communities, your families, and the nation within a nation, and for African people around the world. And don't isolate yourself into just a local or even a national struggle. Link it up globally, as the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey did. One God, one aim, one destiny.
Of humanity, people, you can accomplish what you will.
Hey.
There you go.
Right on, brother.
Okay, thank you so much.
Right on. And I look forward to seeing you on Saturday.
Okay.
And then when we get together later.
Okay.
Hotep.
Okay. Peace and blessings.
Thank you.